Hello everyone. Thank you for standing by and welcome to our Baby Talk webinar sponsored by IsisParenting and Zutano and presented by Dr. Sudha Arunachalam. My name is Cindy Meltzer and I'm the Director of Community and Social Media here at ISIS, and I'll be your moderator this evening. During this hour-long presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. We're hoping that many of your questions will be answered during Sudha's information-packed session. But if you do have questions, we'll take them at the end as time allows. Today's webinar is being recorded, and all of you will receive a link to the recording by email in the next 48 hours. So if you miss something or need to step away to tend to your baby, that's okay. Let me talk a little bit about IsisParenting. ISIS is proud to host this evening's webinar. ISIS is the nation's most trusted prenatal and early parenting destination. We provide innovative programs and a highly edited selection of products for expecting and new families in our 4 Boston area centers and, of course, online at IsisParenting.com. Now let me tell you a little bit about Zutano, our co-sponsor for the presentation. For over 20 years, Zutano has been committed to creating exceptional, innovative, and versatile products. Located in the Green Hills of Vermont, they carefully source only the softest cottons for each new product, creating a line of superior quality clothing and accessories in a rainbow of colors and prints. Zutano is unique as your baby, and it's so cute. I love their stuff. So I'm Cindy Meltzer, as I mentioned, and I'll be your moderator tonight. And it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for the evening, Dr. Sudha Arunachalam. Sudha received a BA from the University of Southern California in Linguistics and Psychology, an MA from the University of Pennsylvania in Psychology, and a PhD also from the University of Pennsylvania in Linguistics. After a postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University, she joined the faculty at Boston University in the fall of 2011, where she is now Assistant Professor in Boston University's Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences. Welcome, Sudha.
Thanks, Cindy. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm absolutely excited to be here and to talk to you a little bit about language development. Thank you. There are so many things that your baby has to learn about language, from what are the sounds in my language and how do I make them with my mouth, to when do I say please and thank you. But I think that the most cherished milestones about language are about words. So today I want to talk specifically about how children learn words. Scientists are now in a better position than ever to figure out what's going on in your baby's mind as she hears you talking and starts to talk herself. So I want to take you through some of this exciting research. Now, keep in mind that, of course, even babies who are developing normally differ hugely in the timeline along which they achieve certain milestones. So I encourage you to try some of the things I'm going to tell you about with your own baby. Just keep in mind, of course, that your child may be following a different timeline, and that may be perfectly normal. So let's start by thinking about what babies have to do in order to learn new words. Baby's first challenge, even before she can really figure out what words mean or start to say them, is finding the word. So how does she discover what a word is in the first place? When we write sentences, we put spaces between the words. So as adults, of course, we know where one word ends and where another word begins. But your baby can't read, and she learns language by listening to you talk. And there are no spaces in speech. We don't pause between our words when we're talking. Sure, we pause between sentences and sometimes between phrases, but we certainly don't pause between each individual word. So baby's task is to hear something like, "Hi baby, shall we go get some milk?" and parse that out into separate individual words. Just to give you an idea of how hard this might be, I'm going to say the same sentence in Tamil, which is a language spoken in India. Are you ready? "Ennakunju paal sapta polama." Now, if you're not a speaker of Tamil, I bet you found it pretty hard to guess how many words there were and where each word began and ended. And before your baby becomes a speaker of English, this is what she's faced with. But we know that they do manage to learn individual words, so let's think about how and when they're able to do so. One really helpful thing for them is knowing what their name sounds like, because you say it all the time. And it doesn't matter if it's their actual name or if you call them Jelly Bean. What matters is that it's a consistent sound that you say often. As early as 4 months, there's evidence that babies seem to recognize their own name in this way, in that it sounds familiar to them. So imagine how this would help you parse up a sentence into individual words if you recognized that consistent sound of your name. So if you look at this classic Gary Larson comic, which shows a dog's name standing out to her in the stream of speech, your baby's name will stand out to her as well. But what your baby can do that your dog can't do is to use that information to pull out other units of sound from the speech stream. So those blah blahs on either side of Ginger would turn into defined pieces. At least they're bounded on one side by something that sounds familiar to her. So your baby can sort of segment the sounds before and after her name into word-like chunks. Remember that at 4 months your baby is cooing, just beginning to be a social little person, but certainly isn't showing any evidence that she really knows any words. So this is pretty remarkable if she seems to know her own name. Now you'll see this little try this at home on the slide to suggest things that you can do with your baby to explore her language development. So if you have a baby who's 4 to 6 months, you can see if she recognizes her own name. So you can try standing off to her side so that she's not looking at you, and then say her name and see if she turns her head. You can also try saying names with the same stress pattern. So if her name were Ginger, you might say Kathy or Bella with the stress on the first syllable. And see if she responds to those names as well. Versus you could try names with the opposite pattern, like Michelle or Janine, where the stress is on the second syllable. So each time you say one of these names, try to use the same happy, positive tone of voice. So the only thing that differs is whether you've said her actual name, or a name with the same stress pattern, or a name with a different stress pattern. If she only turns her head to her own name, that's a pretty good sign that she recognizes the particular sounds that belong in her name and not just the general sound of the word. Now of course she might always turn her head just because you made a noise, or she might never turn her head because she's really interested in something else. But if you try this once in a while on different days, you might find a pattern where she's more likely to turn her head to her own name than either names with similar stress patterns or names with different stress patterns. And then you have some evidence that she recognizes the actual sounds in her own name, even compared to other names that have a similar rhythm. Now there are other cues too that they can use to figure out where the words begin and end. By 7 months, babies show evidence that they understand something about when we normally pause during long sentences. So in this study, the babies heard a little story read out loud. It was a little bit from Cinderella. And the story either had pauses in natural places, like at the ends of sentences, at the ends of clauses. So Cinderella lived in a great big house, pause, but it was sort of dark. Or the story had pauses in unnatural places, like in the middle of sentences and clauses. Cinderella lived in a great big house, but it was, pause, sort of dark because she had, pause, this mean stepmother. Right, so that sounds pretty weird. What the researchers found was that 7-month-olds thought it sounded pretty weird too. They showed surprise at the unnatural version compared to the natural version. Of course, 7-month-olds don't understand the story. They don't know what the words mean or how the sentences divide up the story. Instead, they seem to be responding to the rhythm of language. They've heard enough language even from the womb that they know the general patterns and the ups and downs and pauses in English speech. So what does this mean about finding the words in the sentence? Well, if babies are sensitive to the rhythm of English, they know when to expect clauses to begin and end. This can mark some boundaries for them. They may not know exactly how to divide up all the words in the sentence, but they might be able to pick out the first word or the last word just because the pause, that clause boundary, delineates at least one word boundary for them. Just like knowing their names helps to delineate some word boundaries. So you can try this at home as well. When your 5 to 10-month-old is alert and happy, you can read the natural version and the unnatural version, and try again to use the same happy tone of voice in both cases and see if you get different responses. So maybe she'll stare at you a little bit when you read the unnatural version, or maybe she'll vocalize less often. She might even turn away and look sort of uncomfortable. Okay. So all of this has been to show you how smart your baby is even before the age of 10 months. Now, what can you do to help them parcel out the words from the ongoing speech stream? The answer is that you're probably already doing it. Child-directed speech has all kinds of properties that differ from speech directed to adults that could help her find these word boundaries. I'm not necessarily talking about the stereotypical child-directed speech that some parents find grating. I mean that at least in our culture, when we talk to children, we tend to talk in a certain way. Our speech directed to children tends to have more extreme pitch variation, so more ups and downs in pitch than when we're talking to adults. We also tend to speak more slowly. So you can visualize these differences. I'm going to show you here an image of the pitch contours in adult-directed speech on the left and child-directed speech on the right. And these images are to the same scale for the same sentence, which was, "We're having peas and carrots for dinner." But notice how in the speech directed to children, there are these dramatic ups and downs in the contour. That's the pitch going up and down. "We're having peas and carrots for dinner." And you can see the difference in speech rate as well. The child-directed sentence on the right is longer because it was said more slowly. So you can see that there are quite dramatic differences in the way that we speak to children versus adults. And there are other differences as well. We more consistently pause between phrases and clauses when we're speaking to children. Just as in those natural versions of the Cinderella story, we tend to do that more consistently when we're talking to children. We also tend to speak in shorter sentences, perhaps not surprisingly. This is kind of cool. We tend to make fewer grammatical errors when we're speaking to children, fewer slips of the tongue that lead to incorrect speech. This is probably because we're speaking in shorter sentences and we're speaking more slowly, so it's easier for us to speak correctly the first time. But that's probably a helpful thing for our kids if we're able to speak with fewer errors. And another feature is that we tend to repeat words in different sentence types. So we might say, "It's snowing. Do you see the white snow? Let's go make a snowman." So repeating these words can be helpful as well to help them pick those specific words out from the sentence. Now keep in mind that there are many cultures in which adults don't use child-directed speech as much. So it can't be the case that it's necessary for us to speak this way in order for children to acquire language, because children in all cultures can acquire language. But nevertheless, there is evidence that it's helpful for them to have these features in our speech. This exaggerated, over-the-top way that you talk to your baby can help her figure out what the sounds and words are in her language. Okay, so we've seen how baby can pick out some words from this ongoing speech that has no pauses in it. So let's get on to the fun part. How do they figure out what the words mean? Before we go into it, I want to, just as an aside, tell you a little bit about the methods that we use to learn about this. We can't ask babies questions about what they know or what they think words mean. So instead, we're going to use their eye movements. Looking at their eye movements as they look at pictures or videos on a screen allows us to literally watch them learn. The easiest way to do this is with an eye tracker monitor. That's what I use in my own research. It looks just like a computer monitor, but it has some very fancy cameras embedded in it that allow us to track where the baby is looking on the screen at all times. So it gives us a new data point of the XY coordinates of where she's looking every fraction of a second. So it's a lot of very precise information. Now a recent very exciting study using this method has shown that babies know a lot more about word meanings a lot younger than we ever imagined. At 6 months, infants showed that they knew the meanings of many common nouns. We used to think that even though, as we've seen, by 6 months infants may recognize their own name, they may have learned some things about the general patterns of rhythm in their language, but we wouldn't have thought they could know any word meanings until about 9 to 15 months. So this is pretty astonishing research. Of course, babies understand more than they say, so we have to look at their abilities to understand if we're going to really see how early on they know something. So in this study, they showed 6 to 9 month old infants images on an eye tracker monitor, like the one on the previous slide. So they might see something like a foot and a cup of milk side by side, and they would hear something like, "Where's the milk?" And the infants looked more at the picture that was named, the milk, than the one that was not named, the foot, showing that even by 6 months they knew the meaning of the word milk. And as you can see in these pictures, they tested this with many common items, body parts, foods, household objects. So for example, in the picture at the bottom left, they saw a picture of a face, and they heard, "Where's her nose?" And they looked at the part of the picture where the nose was more than other parts of the face. So they recognize the word nose and they know which part of the face it refers to. This is incredible that even 6-month-olds know the meanings of some of these words. This means that when you're talking to your infant and maybe feeling a little bit silly because they don't really understand you, they actually may be able to understand some of what you say. And certainly the more they hear you talk, the more they can build on what they know. So a baby who knows the word banana may be well positioned to learn other words too, like eat or peel or yellow. So don't feel silly talking to your infant. She's probably understanding more than she lets on. The next question I want to tackle is, where do these meanings come from? How does she begin to figure out what banana means or what ball means? We don't know a whole lot about this question, but there's a lot of research being done. We're learning new things every day. So let's start by asking, what makes a good learning situation for baby? What's a situation in which she hears a word like ball and whatever's going on around her makes it easy for her to learn the meaning of that word? So if you put yourself in baby's shoes for a minute, imagine you're looking around at the world, you're hearing language, but you don't yet know what very many words mean, if any. How might you figure out what any particular word meant? It might seem obvious, so you might think we show them a ball and we say, look, here's a ball. But it can't be this simple. If you think about all the different things that are going on at the same time, all the objects and actions in their view, even in their little worlds, it's got to be hard to figure out which thing is being named. So what might be a good learning situation that would kind of help you figure out what was being talked about, what word is being said? And there's some very clever research that looked at this. Now, instead of asking when babies find it easiest to learn word meanings, they went with a population that's much easier to study. So they studied adults. And they showed adults videos in which parents and children were interacting. And these drawings represent a few scenes from a video like this. But they played the videos with no audio, in silence, so the adults couldn't hear what was being said. And then about 30 seconds into the video, they heard a beep. And they were told at the instant of that beep that the parent had just said a particular word to the child. And they were asked to guess, what word was it? What word did the father say to the child at the exact point that that beep happened? So they were basically having the adults put themselves in the baby's shoes. So you're playing with your dad, or you're just hanging out while your dad is doing stuff around the house or whatever. You hear a lot of language, but you don't know what it means. So that's why in this study they had the adults watch the videos in silence. Now imagine how you might figure out the meaning of any particular one of those words that you heard. You'd probably go on what you were seeing or hearing out in the world at the time, right? So in this illustration, if you were a baby and you heard your dad say some word in that third picture, you might think it was elephant because there's an elephant nearby. Or you might think that he said shoe because the baby's holding a shoe. The idea is that whether a situation is a good or bad learning situation for the child depends on whether the surrounding environment makes it easy to figure out what that word refers to. Are you pointing at an object while you say its name? Is the object close by? If the adult is able to guess the word, that suggests that something about what was going on in the surrounding environment makes it clear what that word is. So if the child had been in that situation, they would have been in a very good position to learn the meaning of whatever that word was. So they showed adults lots of videos like this, and they had them guess what word was being said during the beep. And it turns out that adults are not very good at this guessing game from a silent video. It's hard to look at what's going on in the world and guess what someone is talking about if you don't know or can't hear any of the surrounding words. But some words from some videos were easier to guess than others. So the researchers categorized the videos by whether adults guessed the word easily or only rarely guessed the word. And then they dug deep into those videos to see what properties of them made it easier to guess. So let's look at what some of those properties were. They looked at whether the child was looking at the object, moving or reaching toward the object, or handling the object, and whether the parent was handling the object. And they found that videos that were good learning situations, videos for which adults often made the correct guesses, differed along these dimensions from videos that were not as good learning situations, videos for which adults rarely made the correct guesses. So let's pretend that the word the parent actually said during the beep was elephant, and that they were referring to a stuffed toy elephant that was in the room. Let's see how these different factors contribute to whether it's easy or hard to guess that the word was elephant. Okay, so this is a complicated figure, but it's very cool, so just bear with me and I'll walk you through it. At the bottom of the graph where it says time in seconds, that's actually time unfolding over the course of the video. So remember that adults watched this videotaped scene in silence for 30 seconds and then they heard a beep. That's where the vertical red line is. And that's when the parent actually said elephant. The top half of the graph where it says easy to guess on the left, those were videos for which adults often guessed the word correctly. So these are the good learning situations. The bottom half where it says hard to guess, those were words that the adults rarely guessed correctly. These are the less good learning situations. So if you look at all of these elements, what the child and the parent are doing with the elephant in these videos, you can see first that in the easy to guess videos, all of this interaction happens in a small amount of time. In 15 to 20 seconds before the parent said elephant, the parent is first holding the object, that's the purple bar at the left, and the child is looking at it, that's the red bar. The child is clearly interested in this object because then she moves toward or reaches for that object and she's handling it. And the child may have been holding the object when the parent said the word elephant at the red line. In contrast, if we look at those hard to guess videos, you can see that the interaction takes place over a slightly longer period of time. And in these videos, it's much more likely that the child is first looking at the object, then reaching for and holding the object. And the child had stopped handling that object by about 15 seconds into the video. Then the parent is holding the object. That's the purple bar here. And then she says the word, elephant. So what does this mean? In the hard to guess situations, the parent is naming an object that the child is no longer looking at and holding. Probably no longer interested in. So it's no big surprise that it's hard to figure out what the word meant. The child wasn't even interested in that object anymore by the time the parent said the word elephant. So remember, these are categorized as easy to guess or hard to guess by adults' performance, not kids. But I think there's still some kind of interesting lessons to be learned here. One thing that's striking to me is the small amount of time in which things take place in these easy to guess videos. A really good learning situation is one in which the parent is so attentive to what the child is interested in and attending to and holding that she provides words for those things right away in the moment in a very small period of time while the child is holding it. Very simply, this is just being responsive. Being responsive to what your baby is interested in is in fact associated with her having a bigger vocabulary later on in toddlerhood. So what are some ways that we can be responsive? We can describe things that she's reaching for, exploring, or vocalizing about. Instead of just naming the object, you can expand on that. Oh yes, that's a hat. Look at the pink hat. It looks like a warm hat to wear on a cold winter day, and so on. So remember that even at 6 months, she might actually understand a word like hat. So by talking descriptively, you're giving her the opportunity to learn other words and other things about it. We can also go along with her interests and what she wants to play with and how she wants to play with it. So for example, if your baby is really interested in blocks and stacks up blocks into towers, when she goes to stack up cups into towers, you can just go along with that and encourage it instead of redirecting her to say, oh no, this is a cup, see, you put juice in the cup. If you go along with her interest in stacking cups into towers, that can lead to a good learning situation. And of course, being timely is part of being responsive. So remember that her attention may shift quickly. And if you provide the labels and descriptions when she's interested in them, she can more easily learn. Of course, you're not going to be responsive all the time, or even perhaps most of the time. And of course, you're going to shift her attention all the time when she's playing with something you need or something she shouldn't have, something dangerous. Also keep in mind that the differences that we're talking about, although they're statistically significant, they're quite small. So I think the take-home message here is not so much be responsive all the time, but rather take joy in the fact that when you are able to be responsive, your baby is paying attention and picking up on that and learning new things from it. And you can really try to focus your attention on what she's interested in the moment and kind of go along with that. Okay. Now it's true that good learning situations are ones in which adults are really responsive to what babies are interested in. But I want to tell you about this amazing example of what they can learn even when you're not being particularly responsive. Because yes, good learning situations are helpful for you to create, but remember that your baby is really smart and can learn things even when we don't make it so easy for them. So here's a study that demonstrated that 18-month-old babies are socially very aware and very sensitive to what adults are interested in as well. And they use that information to help them learn new words. So in this study, instead of using words the child already knew, like elephant or ball, they used nonsense made-up words like dax, because they wanted to see if they could teach the child the meaning of a new word to kind of mimic the kinds of learning situations children are faced with just in the real world when they hear a word they don't know the meaning of. So these were 18-month-old toddlers, and what happened was that they were holding an object that was unfamiliar to them, that they didn't know what it was called, and they heard an adult say, "Wow, it's a dax." Now these 18-month-olds, of course, have never heard this word dax, so how is she going to figure out what this word means? What does she do? She looks up at the adult. She sees that the adult is looking at her toy. So she thinks, okay, she's looking at my toy. My toy must be a dax. And after that, if the toddler was shown two toys, one this purple toy she was holding and the other some other unusual toy, if she was asked, where's the dax, she chose the purple one that she was holding when she had heard the adult say, wow, it's a dax. So she's looking up at the adult to figure out, what's she talking about? What's this dax thing she's talking about? And she identifies it with the one that both she and the adult had been interested in. But it gets even more amazing, because in another condition, a different group of babies heard, wow, it's a dax, but the adult wasn't looking at the child or the child's toy. Instead, she was looking elsewhere. She was looking into a bucket. And babies in this condition, when they were later asked, where's the dax, they didn't pick the purple object that they themselves had been playing with, but rather they picked the toy that was in the bucket, even though they couldn't see it at the time. So they again looked up at the adult when they heard the word. Instead of just associating the word with what they were interested in, they looked to see what the adult was interested in. And they learned that the word had to refer to whatever that object was in the bucket. So you can try this at home as well. It's a little bit tricky, but if you put a new unusual toy down near your toddler and sort of sneak away, but when you can see that she's noticed it and is playing with it, face away from her and look into a box or a bowl and say really excitedly, wow, that's a dax. And then to test what she has identified as the dax, what she has associated with that word, you want to put two objects in front of her, one the toy that she was playing with when you said dax, and a different unusual toy that you pull out of the box or the bowl. You want to let her play with both of them until she kind of gets bored with them, and then put them back in front of her and say, where's the dax? And see which one she gives you, if she points to one of them or hands you one of them or looks at one of them more interestedly. If she was paying attention to where you were looking when you said the word dax, she should choose the object that was in the box or the bowl rather than the object that she had been holding at the time. Okay, so now we know a little bit about how babies find the words in running speech and how they figure out what those words mean. We've been talking a lot about what they understand. So now let's think about really beginning to speak. Long before they begin to engage in spoken conversation, babies are learning about and getting better at interacting with you communicatively. Even cooers and babblers seem to take turns as if they were conversing with you. They might babble a little bit and then pause and wait for you to make a noise before they start again. Now, over the course of the 9 to 12 month period, babies get a lot more communicative using pointing and reaching gestures. Even though it's not spoken language yet, these gestures and points may be really important. More pointing and gesturing during this period is associated with having a higher vocabulary later on. Why is this? Well, one thing that pointing and other gestures may do for children is simply to help them achieve successful communication with you and to learn words. So if your baby is really interested in the clock on the wall, if she keeps pointing to it, trying to get your attention and get you to look at the clock too, chances are that you're going to say, oh yes, that's such a pretty clock. So by pointing, your baby has gotten you to identify what she's interested in and to give her the name for that thing. And now she's had the opportunity to learn this new word, clock. So as parents and caregivers, you may be able to help by using your own hands when you talk. If you point to things and encourage your child to point to things, that may sort of spur this communicative idea. In a similar way, there's some evidence that teaching your baby some baby signs can promote her developing vocabulary. Baby sign isn't a sign language, of course, and I'm not necessarily advocating that you teach your child signs, but there's some evidence that when parents use baby sign with their children, they also simultaneously use spoken language. So if your baby has a sign for something, she can more easily call your attention to the fact that that's what she's interested in at the moment. You'll probably tell her all about that thing. So it goes along with your being responsive as a parent to what she's interested in, as we talked about before. But pointing and signs and other kinds of gestures give her another way for her to tell you precisely what she's interested in. So let's move on to her first spoken words. And keep in mind that there's a lot of variability in when kids start to say their first words. Especially if they're hearing more than one language, they might start to say their first words a little bit later on. As long as they seem to be understanding language at an age-appropriate level, probably there is nothing to worry about. But let's see what happens when they start to say their first words. So a very common conversation in households everywhere is a debate about whether mama or papa was baby's first word or whether she was just babbling. Your baby babbles for months before she says her first word, so you're anxiously awaiting that moment when it really seems to mean something. So how do you know when it really does? Well, languages all over the world have words that sound like mama and papa to refer to the parents. Why is that? It's probably because these are really common sounds in babies' babbles. They're among the first sounds that babies tend to produce, and probably we're just so excited to have them say our names that we must appropriate these babbles as our names. But when your baby starts babbling between around 6 to 8 months, she's probably just making noises not so likely to have meaning. But between 10 and 15 months, you'll probably start to see more consistency in these sound-meaning pairings. We want to count a word as referential, as really having meaning, referring to something, when she pretty consistently makes the same sound in the same situation. You can write down when you hear these sounds to just sort of keep a record. Is it much more often da, 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 da when only dad is around than when only mom is around? Or even if it's clearly not the word an adult would use, does she consistently say baba when she's reaching for her cup, but not when she's reaching for a cracker or a toy? If so, this baba for cup is probably her first referential word. But even when babies are in a stage when they're using some sounds pretty consistently in a referential way, they'll sometimes use those sounds in the wrong contexts. And we don't want to say that they don't know what a word means just because they sometimes use it inappropriately. In fact, around ages 1 to 2, up to 1/3 of the nouns that toddlers say might be not quite right, but pretty close. One very common kind of error is using the same word to refer to too broad a range of things. And we call this overextension because they're kind of overusing this word. So she might, for example, use the word dog not only to refer to a dog, but also to other four-legged mammals, maybe even to a bicycle or a motorcycle that's riding around in the street, maybe to a squirrel, maybe even to a furry rug that isn't an animal at all. So what's going on here? Well, it's really hard to tell. It's probably not the case that she thinks that all of those things are dogs. It could be, for example, that she knows the word goat, but she can't access it very quickly. So she pulls out the next best word, the closest thing that she does easily have a word for. It could be that she doesn't know the word goat, but she knows that if she can get you to attend to that goat, that you'll probably tell her what its real name is. So she says kind of a similar name to get your attention to it. Or it could be that she's trying to make a comment about similarity, like, that rug is furry like my dog, but she's too little to put together such a long, complicated thought. So the thing that comes out verbally is just dog. Another really common case of overextension that you might have seen is calling all men daddy or all women mommy. Completely normal and very, very common. Another kind of error that toddlers make is underextension, where they use a word in fewer contexts than they should. So your toddler might say cup to refer only to her sippy cup, but not other kinds of cups. And again, we don't know what this means. Is your toddler in the early stages of talking, maybe only producing one word at a time? If so, she might be saying the word cup to mean, I want my sippy cup. And so, of course, she's frustrated when you hand her a different cup. Or it could be the case that she really does understand the word cup to refer to one specific object and hasn't yet learned to generalize it to all cups. Either way, she'll figure it out as she has more exposure to language and to different situation. So this isn't anything to worry about either. And you can try this at home as well. So just take note of all the different things that your toddler labels with a particular word. See if she overuses or underuses these words. This requires some diligence on your part because it's really hard to know when they're making an error, or maybe you were just failing to understand what they meant. So did she use cow to mean horse, or was she really saying that animal that I don't know what it's called looks like a cow? And underextensions are really hard to notice as well. You have to see whether they call other dogs dog or other kids bottle bottle. It's tough to identify them, but it's kind of a fun exercise, and it might help you have a better picture of all the things that your toddler says and understands. By about 2.5 years, these kinds of errors typically drop off by a lot. So you can look for them in the 1 to 2 age range. So baby's last challenge for today is going beyond names for things. 2-year-olds learn about 2 new words each day. But so far, everything that we've talked about has been about nouns, about names for simple everyday objects before the age of 2. So what about other kinds of words? Well, it turns out that the reason we started talking about nouns, about names for simple objects, is that most of babies' early words are nouns. These are some of the words that English acquiring babies tend to produce first. So notice there are mostly names for objects and people, some social words like bye-bye or uh-oh, some descriptive words. These are the words that tend to predominate in their vocabularies from about 10 to 15 months. As they move into 1.5 to 2.5, you tend to see lots more adjectives and verbs. So why might this be? Well, if you remember earlier when we talked about what makes a good learning situation, we said it's great if baby can look at the object and hold the object. Well, imagine how hard it is to learn verbs, for example. We can hold the ball in our hands, but we can't hold an action. It's even hard to point to an action. Lots of actions happen so quickly. So if you throw the ball or kick the ball, it's kind of hard to point out that action to your little one while it's actually going on. It's no coincidence then that they might have a few verbs early on, but they tend to start adding lots of verbs a little bit later in the toddler years after they already have some nouns. So if you keep track of their development, you'll be able to see what kinds of words they use and how they add them and how often. But what about the little words and the pieces of words like the ed and the ing and the possessive apostrophe s? These are very frequent in the speech we produce when we talk to children. But notice that children don't seem to produce them themselves until they're maybe 2.5 or 3. These little words and pieces of words are functional. They don't contribute a lot of content, but nevertheless they convey important information. So the plural s tells us whether there was more than one. The past tense ed tells us it happened in the past, of course. So what do toddlers and preschoolers know about these little pieces? There's a now classic study that looked at this question, and it's called the WUG study. And it looked at what kids know about these little pieces of functional meaning. So first they showed children a picture of this adorable creature, and the experimenter said to the child, look, this is a WUG. Then they showed them 2 of the same, and they said to the child, now there's another one. There are 2 of them. There are 2. And the child was supposed to fill in the blank and say WUGs. Of course, they've never heard the word WUG before. So in order to know that the answer is WUGs, they have to have a really general understanding of how to form plurals in English. And they have to be able to apply this even to new words that they've never heard. It's pretty amazing. It shows that their knowledge of these little functional pieces of words like plural endings isn't just memorizing dog, dogs, but rather it's some kind of more general and abstract knowledge that they can apply as they learn new words. You can try this at home and see the development from ages 2.5 to 5. At 2 and 3, your child will probably struggle with this, but as they get to 4, 5, and 6, they start to do much better. You can also try it with verbs in past tense. So if you say, this man really likes to rick. Yesterday he, and you see if they say ricked. Even if your child does do well at this little game, children make a lot of errors with these little words and parts of words in their speech, in large part because many of these are irregular in English and they don't follow those nice rules like add s to make a plural or add ed to make past tense. It's completely normal for them to say things like, teeth instead of teeth, or goad instead of went, mouses instead of mice, and all of that, well into elementary school as they're figuring out how English works. So one question is, should you correct them when they make these errors? When they're little, we usually don't correct children's grammar errors. We tend to focus much more on their content. And this is actually just fine. If you do try to correct grammar in the preschool years, it might be pretty frustrating for you and maybe not so helpful for your child. So here's the kind of thing that might happen if you try to correct grammar. This is an excerpt from a popular mommy blog, Deuce.com, where she describes an exchange with her then 3-year-old daughter Lita and Lita's dad John. So Lita says over and over, "Does her want to play with me? Does her want to play with me? Does her want to play with me?" And John keeps correcting her, so trying to get her to say, "Does she want to play with me?" But she's not very interested in grammar. She just wants to know the answer to her question. So she keeps repeating, "Her wants to play with me, her wants to play with me." Then, "Lita," John said firmly, "it's she wants to play with me." "Okay," Lita says, "I want to play with she." So this is the kind of thing that might happen when you try to correct grammatical errors. They don't really seem to get the hang of it. There's no need to feel frustrated about these kinds of errors. They do overcome them with time. One thing that you can do instead of trying to correct them explicitly is maybe kind of repeat it back correctly in a natural way that moves the conversation along. So for example, if your child says, "I holded the baby rabbits," you can say, "Oh, you held the baby rabbits? What did they feel like? Were they soft?" So she gets to hear the correct form, but neither of you have to feel frustrated that you're correcting and she's not getting it and it's just not going anywhere and the conversation just comes to an end. Okay, so the take-home message here. I hope I've given you some examples of how your baby is learning so much about language so early on. And lots of the things that you're already doing, using child-directed speech, gesturing, being responsive, are really good things to do. So if you want to support and promote your child's language development, just keep talking to her, keep engaging, keep appreciating all the things that she already knows and is learning every day. Last words here. All of the research I've told you about is possible because families like you bring your children in to participate in studies in research centers like mine. So I hope that you'll sign up to join us. If you're not in the Boston area, you can contact your nearest university. There are likely to be many research efforts going on. These visits are usually a lot of fun for the kids. We play with toys in our child-friendly play area, and then we might watch a short video or play a game with some toys. Playtime for the kids, but for us it provides valuable insights into what's going on in their minds. So if you're in the Boston area and you're interested in participating or you have any questions about our research, please do give us a call. The last couple of slides just have some references for some of the research that I talked about today. So if you're interested in kind of reading some more, you can look at these at your leisure.
Sudha, thank you so much. That was fascinating, really.
Thanks, my pleasure.
I know many research fans out there like me love hearing about this kind of thing when it comes to our kids. It really is so interesting. We had a number of questions come in during your presentation. I hope we have just a few minutes here to take some questions, so I hope you're able to take a few of them.
Sure.
We had a couple of people asking about gender differences and what the research might show about gender differences in when children learn language and how they learn language. Can you speak to that at all?
Great question. So there's this sort of idea that boys tend to be less verbal than girls. They tend to have fewer words and start to speak later on. That is absolutely borne out by the research. So it does seem to be the case that boys may have fewer words. They may say their first word a little bit later on. There are also different strategies in the kinds of words that children use. So some children tend to have a lot of social words early on. Other children tend to have lots of names for objects. And you see some gender differences there as well. A lot of it depends too on your child's personality and how you play with them. So if you're playing with, if you're reading books, for example, that's a really good opportunity for all kids where you're going to be doing more labeling of objects. You're going to be pointing out things and saying that's a balloon, that's a cat, that's a bunny. But if you're playing with trucks, that might lend itself more to sort of action words, talking about where things are going and constructing stories. So the differences in how you play with your kids and how you interact with them may lead to differences in their language development. But there also are very likely to be real gender differences where boys develop more slowly. And certainly neither of these things are anything to worry about. Everybody sort of comes out, in the same place at the end.
That's good to hear. We also have a question about bilingual households. Somebody would like to know, do children raised in bilingual households have delayed speech development?
So yes and no. It is true that many bilingual children or children being raised in homes where more than one language is spoken, whether it's 2 or 5, they may be slower to say their first words. You may find that if you were to count up how many words they speak in one of those languages at, say, 18 months, it might be fewer than average for children who are only hearing one language at home. But if you count up the words that they say in all of their languages combined, typically you get a bigger number than the vocabulary size of a child who's only hearing one language. So you may indeed see what looks like slower later development early on. But what you find with bilingual kids is that they catch up by school age, and they have similar vocabulary sizes. And as we know, there are many benefits to bilingualism or multilingualism. Aside from just knowing more than one language, there are benefits. It seems to be good for brain development in various ways. It seems to be related to other aspects of their cognitive development. So there's certainly no harm in having a multilingual household.
Great. Okay, another question. I'm just scrolling through all the conversation here. You were talking about correcting grammar and how it can be an exercise in frustration with younger age children and toddlers. At what age, someone would like to know, can you begin to correct grammar, or will it start sort of sinking in?
Oh, you know what? I really think it depends on the kid. I don't think that you really need to correct grammar at any age. I think that kids will come out speaking in the way that their peers do and the way that the adults in their lives do. What's interesting though is if you're interested in correcting grammar in terms of having them speak a particular dialect of English. So you may think that certain rules that you learned in English class, like don't end a sentence with a preposition, that those are things that you want your child to learn. And if that's the case, then really there's probably no hope for it, because all of us end our sentences with prepositions. But if you're really worried about things like goed versus went, those things absolutely sort themselves out over time, because your child is hearing went and not goed. So the correct form is constantly being reinforced for her, and the incorrect form just drops off very quickly.
That makes sense. I have another dual language household related question. This person asks, how important is it for separate people to speak different languages to the child, like mom speaks one language and dad speaks another? Or will mom speaking 2 languages be okay or just confusing?
It's absolutely not confusing. Even at a very young age, infants can distinguish 2 languages spoken by the same voice. So it shouldn't be a problem if the same parent speaks more than one language. A lot of parents do find that it's helpful if they divide up the languages among the parents, or maybe parents versus grandparents or something like that. But I think that's more of a practical issue. It gives the child a need to speak both the languages, because if you want to talk to daddy, you have to speak in French, and if you want to talk to mommy, you have to speak in English. So it sort of forces them to use both of those languages. Always the risk with trying to raise a child multilingually is they'll find that they can get away without it if you give them the opportunity to only speak one language. then they might very well take it. So if you're only going to give them a little bit of exposure to the other language, you might find that it's really challenging unless you kind of divide up the parenting duties in that way.
Okay, here's another situation, second language situation where someone is asking, she's trying to introduce a second language. The baby's father is Danish, and she'd like for the baby and herself to become fluent. But since she's not, she can't speak to the baby's father in Danish. So she's wondering how to introduce it. If Dad only uses it occasionally, how will the baby know or start to learn the language?
There's always a problem with the amount of exposure. So if the baby is only getting a little bit of exposure to the language, she's probably not going to learn it. Although there is evidence that she might find it easier to learn more explicitly later on as a second language, even if she's an older child or maybe even an adult. But in terms of introducing the language, it's really just trying to build in as much exposure as you can. So even if mom only uses the language when she can during a diaper routine or a feeding routine or whatever words that she has, if she's really intent on introducing those words, just pick an opportunity when you can use those words and use them consistently.
Great. Now here's a simple question that I'm sure is much more complicated than what it appears. Someone asks, what is your best tip to help your child learn to speak?
Learn to speak?
Yes.
Well, they'll probably just learn to speak all by themselves. Really the best thing that you can do is, like I said, talk to them. We were just talking about when you're pushing the stroller, you can talk to your baby about what's going on around them, or you can text on your BlackBerry. So the amount of time that you spend just giving your child language input, the more they'll be able to figure out how the language works. And if you create a situation in which they want to communicate with you, of course, all kids are going to want to communicate with you, they'll just figure out how to speak all on their own.
Now, we only have time for about one more question here. What about language development and early signs of autism? Can you speak on that at all?
Sure. Autism is just such a varied disorder. There's so many different signs. It's really tricky to pick out any one thing that you should be looking for. A lot of them early on, a lot of what you might look for are more social things rather than language things. So it may not be the case. Language may not appear to be impaired in any way. But in general, with early signs of disorder of any kind of language problem, what you really want to look for is whether there seems to be comprehension. So even if your child isn't saying very much, if she seems to understand, again, at an age-appropriate level, then you probably don't have anything to worry about. She may just be a late bloomer in that category. But for autism in particular, it's really just such a broad thing with so many different kinds of manifestations that there's no particular language thing that you should be looking for.
Got it. Let's see if we can do one last quick one there. Unfortunately, there are more questions coming in than we have time for. Any tips for helping a child with articulation? Others are having a hard time understanding him. He's almost 3.
That's one of those where I have to say, if you're worried about articulation, then you need to talk to your pediatrician or talk to a speech language pathologist. There are a lot of great therapies, not just things to do in the clinic, but also sort of take-home things that you can do. I'm unfortunately not a clinician, so I can't help you with that. But you should definitely go talk to someone if you are worried about that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for coming today. We have come to the end, unfortunately, of our presentation. But remember to check your email for the presentation recording, which we'll send out within a couple of days. And Sudha, thank you so much for sharing all of this valuable information with our audience tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thanks to everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at another ISIS online event soon. Bye-bye. Have a great night.